Welcome to the Jamesburg Presbyterian Church. Today is Tuesday, July the 20th, 2021. It's good to know that there are people watching on Facebook. It's good to know that there are people watching on YouTube. Welcome to this final installment of the Gospel according to Mark. 10 weeks ago, I said that we would do this study in about 9 weeks, and we've done a very aggressive study, taking basically 2 chapters every week. We started in May, the middle of May, and we are now ending in the middle of July, so we're at least close to it. Next week we're taking a week off from a Bible study, and then the following week we'll begin a new one. I haven't decided just yet what to do. Next, I want to stay in the New Testament, but I need to make that determination, and I will make it today and announce it on Facebook in a written message, and then it'll be on slides for the worship service, and maybe even tomorrow during the devotional I can say where we're going next. But we are taking 1 week off. Today we're taking a look at the final 2 chapters of the Gospel according to Mark, chapters 15 and 16. This is the story of the trial before Pilate, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. These are complicated stories. Now, the story itself doesn't tell us about the complications. There are a few allusions to the complications, but we're not told specifically that this is a complicated story. And what I mean by this is first of all, the politics of Jerusalem in this time period. We know this from other accounts, especially Josephus, that the politics were extremely divided. Everyone is contending for power, political power, for what they want, and hoping that everybody else doesn't get what they want. We're looking today at 2 particular power structures: the Romans, who by all rights, because they have the military clout, should be in phenomenal power. But Pilate is walking a very thin line between power and not having power. He has done a couple things in the past that are not recorded in the New Testament, building an aqueduct, putting statues of Caesar in Jerusalem, especially near the temple. These are offenses to the Jewish people. There were insurrections. People rose up in protest. Pilate put down some of those protests with brutal force. The Jewish people went to Rome in an embassy. Pilate was told they needed to cut it out by the Romans. So Pilate is holding on to power as best he can. So there's a sense in which Pilate is going to give the Jewish people what they want when it's expedient for him. We also have the temple cult. The temple cult are the religious leaders of the time. This would involve the Sanhedrin, who we will see are divided within themselves. Joseph of Arimathea is a Sanhedrin. He goes to reclaim the body of Jesus from Pilate. Pilate obviously recognizes the clout, the political clout and leverage that Joseph has, and gives the body to Joseph of Arimathea. Now, this is highly unusual because bodies of crucified people were made to hang until they literally fell from the cross because they rotted or they were eaten away by animals. So to give Jesus' body over to Joseph of Arimathea literally within the day in which he was crucified is highly unusual. It says something about, again, the power structures of the time period. But keep in mind, it is the Sadducees who were involved in getting Jesus crucified in the first place. So now you have a Sadducee going to retrieve the bodies. But even more than that, the religious leaders of that day were holding on to power as best they could. One of the reasons they had Jesus crucified was for fear of his followers rising up against them. Then you have the Essenes. The Essenes are a Jewish sect within Judaism living in Jerusalem. They have an enclave in the southwestern portion of the city. They are also a group that is vying for power. They are very much against the temple cult. They do not believe that that the religious leaders are doing Judaism correctly. They see the Jewish leaders as being engaged in collaboration with the Romans, which was highly unpopular. Then you have the Zealots, and as a matter of fact, we're going to find out, historically speaking, that the Zealots ultimately rise to power because they staged the revolt in Jerusalem around 68 AD that results in General Titus taking on the the people of Israel and putting them down by lethal force, destroying the city of Jerusalem, destroying the temple. But the Zealots are going to be a group that also vie for power. So it's a very divided, politically divided city, and this complicates the story. Mark doesn't point this out. Mark doesn't have a reason to point it out. He's just telling us the facts, but we need to know that background to understand exactly why things unfold the way they unfold. So we're told that very early in the morning, this would probably be maybe around 6 a.m., the Sadducees go before Pilate. The chief priests, the scribes, and teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reach a decision. They bound Jesus and led him away and handed him over to Pilate. Now, Jesus, just as he did not answer questions before the Jewish leaders, does not answer questions before Pilate. This confirms the psalmist saying he was silent before his shearers as a lamb. He made no reply. We're told that by Mark that that Pilate gives the people an opportunity to ask for a person to be released. One of the people that's offered is Jesus. The other is Barabbas. We're told later on that Barabbas is part of the brigands. We learned this last week, who end up occupying the temple during the attempt to overthrow the Romans out of Jerusalem in 68 AD. Barabbas has been charged with insurrection, which is the same offense that they're accusing Jesus of. Pilate seems to treat Jesus as if he is already convicted of this crime by offering up two criminals, and the people want Barabbas rather than Pilate. Now, incidentally, there is nothing historically, there's no other place where it's confirmed that the governor or Pilate would do such a thing, offer up a criminal. This would be comparable to offering up a criminal today because I'm just a nice guy and I want to do something nice. I'm going to give you a notorious criminal that's been involved in killing soldiers and police officers and everybody else and politicians. This probably didn't happen. But Pilate does this. And in one other faction within this, there's the whole hope that Jerusalem will be able to establish a king again. Herod the Great was the last king. Archelaus became king, but that title was taken from him by Caesar, and Caesar was given the right to be a person who could make decisions in capital cases. The Jewish people did not have the right to execute anyone. So the reason they brought Jesus to Pilate is to ask Pilate to execute him. And Pilate certainly has that ability. Now, Pilate would have been aware of Caiaphas, would have had dealings with him in the past, would have brought Caiaphas in to consult on matters to try to keep the peace in Jerusalem. But Pilate is free to do whatever he wants. He can release Jesus. He has that power. He can convict Jesus on his own. He has that power, and he can sentence him to death or any other kind of punishment as he chooses. We know for a fact that Pilate has absolutely no sympathy for the Jewish people. He has done things in the past and these are corroborated by Josephus. He has done things in the past to show his disdain for the Jewish people. So Pilate would not have hesitated for even a moment to execute Jesus, especially if it would seem expedient for him to keep the peace in Jerusalem with all these people. Now, the other matter that complicates things is the fact that this is the Passover. Passovers sometimes draw as many as 3 million people to the capital city and the surrounding area for the Passover feast. So what Pilate is facing is the possibility of a revolt against the Roman garrison there. Pilate may believe that he doesn't have enough military clout to defeat the Jewish people if they all rose up against him. So there is that concern, even though we're not told that as such. So to execute one irrelevant person from Pilate's perspective, this Jesus, who cares? If it keeps the peace, that works. So Pilate would have absolutely no sympathy for Jesus whatsoever. Mark doesn't tell us that. Mark wants us to believe that Pilate actually sees Jesus as an innocent man, a victim of the circumstances. The reason is, if you're trying to sell a religion or a movement, the Jesus movement, to Gentiles, members of the Roman Empire, you can't do it if you're saying that Pilate, a prominent leader within the Roman Empire, saw Jesus as a criminal and therefore had Jesus executed. So you want to at least not tell that part of the story. So we have Pilate appear as if he is sympathetic to Jesus, which undoubtedly he would not have been given the circumstances. So the charge that they bring before Jesus is one of insurrection. He claims to be king of the Jews. There is no king of the Jews at this point in time. There's Pilate, and Pilate knows that. And Pilate has no fear of somebody rising up to become the new king. Roman legal procedure automatically proclaimed guilty a defendant who offers no defense on his own behalf. So with Jesus remaining silent, the law says you are guilty. End of story. So the only question is who gets released and who gets sentenced. And apparently Barabbas has led a rebellious revolt in the past. He has also been convicted of the same thing Jesus is convicted of. So Jesus' silence ends up convicting him according to Roman law. Josephus tells us that the Jewish rebellion was fomented by bandits like Barabbas who gained control of Judea and Jerusalem. So there were internal struggles for power. And these internal struggles, these divisions, ended up becoming the very thing that destroys Jerusalem. So by having the Jewish leaders ask for Barabbas, they're actually beginning their own demise. There is no evidence of granting amnesty as a general custom outside the New Testament. Mark wishes to make it clear that the Roman prefect thought Jesus innocent. He needs a reason to explain why Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified. So all the blame is placed upon the rowdy group of people calling for Jesus to be crucified. Mark does not explain what amazed Pilate about Jesus' conduct at the proceedings. No one would expect the Roman governor to consider anything but Roman interest in dealing with this case. So the Sanhedrin have had a mock trial. Now there is virtually no trial before the Romans. Jesus' silence is what convicts him. So what happens is Jesus is led off to be crucified. In chapter 15, verses 21 through 41, these 20 verses, Jesus is led off. Jesus is unable to carry the cross. He falls under the weight of it. He has been beaten. He has been mocked by the soldiers. And so they grab a man by the name of Simon, who is the father of Alexander and Rufus. Presumably, the people in Mark's audience would know Alexander and Rufus. This is why you would mention those names. So it gives some authenticity to the stories. Another fact that can be researched and by the people reading Mark, and the Romans force him to carry this piece to Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. In the ninth hour, Jesus cries out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then with a loud voice, Jesus breathes his last breath, and the centurion concludes this portion of the story by saying, surely this man was the Son of God. One of the things that we always see in any depictions of Jesus carrying the cross is Jesus carrying the whole cross. This is highly unlikely. The Romans had a number of different kinds of crosses that they used. One cross was in the shape of an X, one cross was in the shape of a T, one cross was in the shape of kind of like the plus sign. Part of it had to do with the availability of wood. Part of it had to do with the availability of nails. Nails were not a dime a dozen. They weren't plentiful. Nails were often used over and over and over again. What we do know is that usually a criminal being led to crucifixion would carry the crossbar. That would be the horizontal piece. The vertical piece would already be in place. In Golgotha, by tradition, we know that it was a very stony place. They would have bore holes in the ground. The upright part would be already there, anchored, probably wedged in by rocks. And the cross piece, the crossbar, the horizontal piece, would be the part that Jesus would carry. The whole cross could weigh over 300 pounds. The cross piece could weigh no more than about 100 pounds. So Jesus is unable to carry this, not because he is a weakling, but because he's already been beaten half to death. So this part of the cross is carried by Simon of Cyrene. When they got to the place where he would be crucified, he would be laid down, he would be stripped of all clothing. He would not be wearing a loincloth either. This was in part to humiliate the person who is crucified. Women were crucified as well as men. One of the things that the Romans sometimes did for women, they were also crucified without any clothing, is they would be crucified facing the cross to give them a modicum of modesty. Anyway, Jesus is crucified. The nails would have been pounded not through his palms, but through his wrists. And there would have also been ropes tied around his forearm to hold him onto that beam. The beam was then hoisted up onto the vertical portion of the cross, and then his feet would be nailed to that beam. Now, if the Romans were interested in having you die quickly, if they were being kind and generous, what we would do is accidentally on purpose, while they were pounding the nail through your feet, and it could be one nail through 2 feet or one nail through each foot, and usually the nail went through the ankle, not through the foot part per se, but they would accidentally miss the nail and crush the lower part of your leg so that you were not able to stand on the nail. If you were able to stand on the nail, you could push up and grasp for air. You could breathe that way. So the crucifixion, in this case, we're told they did not break any of Jesus' bones. They want him to suffer as much as possible, for as long as possible. Stand on the nail, get as much breath as you can, live as long as you can. Crucifixions could take up to 3 days. Now, one of the things about the Romans is that the group that went out with you for crucifixion had to stay there until you were dead. So that would be another reason for trying to break the crucified's legs so that you don't have to stay there for 3 days. But crucifixion could take up to 3 days. Most people lived at least 24 hours. Jesus, it appears, died within 6 hours. Again, it has to do with the fact that they beat him half to death. They do in verse 23, chapter 15, they do give him wine and myrrh. He refuses it. This would be comparable to a narcotic, wine and myrrh. His refusal to drink this indicates that he is fully conscious throughout the crucifixion. He will not fall asleep at the crucial hour, as his disciples did at Gethsemane. This detail may be intended to underline the fact that Jesus dies in full possession of his mental faculties. We're told that the people standing at the cross watching this execution mock him. They say, you said that the temple would be torn down in 3 days. Well, why don't you show us a magic trick and get yourself off of this cross? You saved others. Why don't you save yourself? Even those who are crucified with him, the two criminals on either side, mock him. Everyone is mocking him. The disciples are noticeably absent here. Only there are a few women who have followed him around. They are present, and I'll get into more about why they need to be present in just a moment. We're told that Jesus cries out this Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, and this is a quote from Psalm 24. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? This is an important verse for him to say, because it reflects that the suffering servant, actually it's Psalm 22 verse 1. This is an important verse for him to say. Psalm 22, Psalm 23, and Psalm 24 are psalms that are typically associated with the Messiah, the Messianic prophecy. This is an important verse for him to say because it reflects the suffering servant in the Psalms. Now, one of the questions that commentators bring up, I don't think it's an extremely important comment, but I'll call it to your attention, and that is the classic question. When Jesus cites just a portion, one verse of that psalm, the first verse, does Mark mean for us to go back now to that psalm and read the entire psalm? Or is it just enough for us to know about Psalm 22 and know that it's a suffering servant psalm and that Jesus is referring us back to that psalm? So within Christendom, the early Christendom, at the reading of this part of Mark, there was usually a reading of Psalm 22. But then as we move forward into history, Psalm 22 gets lost, and we just focus on the Easter story itself, the crucifixion story itself. Mark's readers. Now, the other thing a detail that gets mentioned is that the veil in the temple is torn. There were two veils. There was an outer veil which had the signs of the zodiac on it, and there was an inner veil. The inner veil separates the Holy of Holies from where the people are. So the question becomes, and Mark doesn't tell us, which veil is torn. Tradition holds, depending upon which tradition, that both of them are torn. Some people are saying it's the zodiac that's torn. And the reason why the zodiac veil is torn is that every important death in history, it was believed, was associated with a cosmological sign. For example, we know that when Julius Caesar died, according to historians, that there was a darkening of the sun. There was a dark time. Whether or not that's true, the tradition certainly holds that this happened. So the darkness would come, we're told in the Gospels, darkness came, indicating that Jesus is an important death to note. But we're also told that the zodiac veil in the temple is torn. Now, it's interesting that the temple even has a zodiac veil. Now, if the inner veil is torn, that would mean that there is no separation between God and humanity. that barrier that separates the Holy of Holies from humanity is torn down. So depending upon which of the stories we want to go with, which meaning we want to have, that's the veil we will pick. So in verses 35 through 36, after Jesus utters what he utters, somebody again tries to offer him some wine. This would have been common wine, vinegar wine, that the soldiers would have brought. Remember, they're there for a long time. They're going to be doing some drinking. And people are now looking to see if Elijah will come and save Jesus. Of course, they believe that Elijah has already come in the form of John the Baptizer. Will John the Baptizer come and save Jesus at this point, or will that be a futile call? Finally, we're told in chapter 15 in verses 40 through 41 that three particular women are there: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. These are identified as the three women who are there. Later on, they will be women who follow Joseph of Arimathea to the tomb. It's important that they know where Jesus is buried, so that when they go on resurrection morning, we can know for sure that they didn't go to an empty tomb by mistake. They went to the real deal. Jesus is buried in verses 42 through 47. We're approaching the evening of the Sabbath. This is a day of preparation, and so there's not time to do the right thing for the burial. Joseph is going to wrap the body as best he can and put it into a tomb. And the reason for this is Joseph of Arimathea has had some questions about who Jesus really is, and perhaps sees him as a prophet, and to have a prophet hanging on the cross during the Sabbath would be an abomination for the people. Having the two criminals there is a whole different other story, but having a prophet hanging from the cross is an abomination. Here is a fact that Mark gives us without making a big deal about it. When John the Baptizer is executed by Herod, John the Baptizer's disciples go on a kind of military expedition, retrieve the body at the possibility of personal risk, retrieve that body and bury it. This does not happen in the case of Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea does it, but Jesus' disciples are not involved. Again, a contrast to show that Jesus' disciples are not have left Jesus. They are not working on his behalf. The contrast later on after the resurrection will be all the more startling. In chapter 16, verses 1 through 20, we have a little bit of a controversy. All scholars believe that Mark's gospel ends at verse 8. Now, the question becomes, did Mark write more and we just lost it from the manuscript? Don't know. Did Mark write just to verse 8 and leave that as a literary device? Okay, so you haven't told us how the story ends. That means we have to go out and find out how the story ends. Is that what Mark's proposition is here? Or did somebody not like what Mark wrote and wrote the additional verses 9 through 20? What we can be sure of is that 9 through 20 are not Mark's work. They're somebody else's work. And while it may trouble us to hear this, this is a conclusion that virtually all scholars agree with. We're told about the Easter story. The Easter story is a familiar story for us. And again, the earliest manuscripts end with verse 8, and verse 8 reads as follows: "Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." Not a very good ending. How do we get to the Jesus movement? How do we get to Peter and the disciples taking up the cause of Jesus if the women are saying nothing to anyone. Obviously, the addition, verses 9 through 20, are there because somebody else was dissatisfied with that ending. Did Mark want to end with verse 8, or did Mark end with something else, and for whatever reason, we don't have it? The Passion predictions include the notice that Jesus will rise from the dead 3 days after his burial. Now, if you look at it, it's not literally 3 24-hour periods. He's buried on a Friday. There's Saturday. He rises on a Sunday. So not exactly 3 24-hour periods, but it does cover, technically speaking, 3 days. The angel tells the women at the tomb that Jesus has been raised and sends them to remind the disciples of Jesus' promise. So they're told to go out and proclaim something, but we're told by Mark that they don't do that because they are afraid. The resurrection, one of the things that people knew back in these days, in Jesus' day, is that resurrection means something a little different than how we mean it. We mean that Jesus literally rose in the same body that he had. People back in Jesus' day would believe that somehow that body is transformed. Now, at the same time, the other gospel writers tell us that he still had the nail prints in his hands, the spear print in his side. Would he have still been bloodied? We don't know. But resurrection does not imply return to the condition of bodily existence, such as in the revival of Jairus' daughter, but it means something more. Like it means becoming kind of like an angel, radiant, like in the story of the Transfiguration. Readers know the resurrection of the righteous represents the end-time renewal of all creation. So there would be a sense in which first century, we're dealing with an ambiguity here. On the one hand, we need to be sure that Jesus is really the one that was crucified, so there needs to be that evidence. But at the same time, we would know that the body that was buried is not the same body that he would have, that there's some sort of transformation, some sort of transfiguration. Mark's readers will recognize that the angelic proclamation, he has been raised, indicates Jesus' special heavenly status. In the Jewish tradition, Enoch, Moses, and Elijah all have been translated into heavenly glory. The gospel ends in the final verses of the gospel. We see that Peter is told, Peter comes to believe. We see that resurrection story that has become so much a part of the Easter story. We're told how this goes, and it gives an explanation for how the Jesus movement picks up, why it picks up. And while Mark says that there's nothing to indicate that the women broke their silence, we do know that somehow the story does get told. And how would the story get told, even the women being at the tomb, for they were the only ones, if the women had always remained silent? So maybe that's Mark's idea, to end with the women being silent because they were afraid. But then how does that story get told? They obviously told it, and that is good enough for Mark's conclusion. Anyway, what we learn is that the powerlessness of Jesus on the cross has been broken apart, and that evil and intimidation and injustice has been replaced with the rule of God in the form of the resurrection of Jesus. So the story ends at a point in which Christendom begins. And if you're tuning in, hopefully it's because you have accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior. Hopefully that means that you are a follower of Jesus, that you're living a life that is pleasing to God, that you have been transformed in some meaningful way. And so you are an heir of this wonderful story. You live with a hope in your life that death is not the end to life, but only the changing of one chapter to the next chapter of your own living. The gospel of Jesus Christ, whether we're reading it in Mark or John or Luke or Matthew, is an exciting story because of the hope that it gives us about life in our world. And I hope that you will think about the things we have talked about over the last 9 weeks, actually 10 because we took 1 week off, over the last 10 weeks, over the last 9 weeks of this study. I hope you will take that to heart and be transformed by it. This has been a very ambitious, fast-moving, fast-paced study. It couldn't have been done, I don't think it could have been done with justice to the chapters in a shorter period of time. And there's a sense in which we should have spent so much more time working on this. Even a chapter a week, which would have taken 16 weeks, would be a pretty ambitious project. But I hope that you will have enjoyed this study and will take it to heart. Thank you very much for tuning in. I know that so many of you watch. Thank you for the comments that you leave. They're very humbling for me to read, and I very much appreciate it. And I will, if you want to suggest something for us to do next, you can do that in the comments for this installment, or email me, or message me, or whatever you would like to do, and I'll take every recommendation into consideration. Thank you very much for tuning in. Stay well, stay safe. I will do a devotional tomorrow, and I will see you soon. Thank you. Bye now.